philosophies and really foregrounding models, indigenous models of kind of environmental relationships in a number of different mediums, including video, sculpture, photography, sound, glass, and stone. And for this exhibition at the Whitney, two specially made pieces that I'll say more about in my longer introduction later in augmented reality. Wanda Nanibush is an Anishinaabe Kwe image and word warrior, image and word warrior, curator and community organizer from Beausoleil First Nation. And she is currently the inaugural curator of Indigenous Art and co-head of the Indigenous and Canadian Art Department at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Her current exhibition there, Rebecca Belmore, Facing the Monumental, is touring internationally, as well as two independent projects, Nanibozo's Sisters, Dalhousie, and Sovereign Acts. Wanda has a master's in visual studies from the University of Toronto, where she's taught graduate courses, and as well as many catalogue essays, she's published widely on Indigenous art, politics, history, and feminism and sexuality. Richard Bell lives and works in Brisbane, Australia, and works across a variety of mediums, including painting, installation, performance, and video. One of Australia's most significant artists, Richard's work explores the complex artistic and political problems of Western, colonial, and Indigenous art production. He grew out of a generation of Aboriginal activists and has remained committed to the politics of Aboriginal emancipation and self-determination. In 2003, he was the recipient of the Telstra National Aboriginal Art Award, establishing him as an important Australian artistic figure, and his work is represented in most Australian national and state collections, and he'll be telling us, among other things, about this wonderful project in Venice during the Biennale, and his upcoming project also at Tate Modern in London. So welcome. So welcome to our three speakers. And I'm just going to start by some introductory remarks. I'm really delighted to be curating and presenting this show of Alan's work. Just to put this discussion in context as well, I just wanted to mention that there are about 3,000 native nations representing approximately 250 million people across the world within 200 states that have sovereignty over them. So that's sort of the context also for this global question that we're going to be talking about. So, as those of you who've seen the show already know, Wolf Nation is the name both of Alan's exhibition and of a video installation that was recently acquired by the Whitney, which is on show on the 5th floor upstairs, along with 3 other works in the exhibition, including one in the lobby. And part of the profound impact of this show for me is the way in which it draws on historical memory and Indigenous philosophy to reveal and challenge disturbing colonial legacies by powerfully and subtly shifting the way we see. Each work is horizontal or circular in form, echoing Indigenous concepts of time and space, multi-perspectival and cyclical, rather than singular and linear. When we walk into Wolf Nation, we see a group of red wolves, a critically endangered species. There are only around about 17 of them left in America, at night, sitting amongst a group of trees. The soundtrack by White Mountain Apache artist Laura Ortman weaves the howls of the wolves into a composition that, along with the extreme horizontal wide projection, resituates our gaze and our experience. And in order to properly understand the significance of this, it's important to recognize that our default experience of the moving image in art is a projective spectacularity born out of a white cinema, and that cinema itself is a colonial cultural form. As Ella Shohat and Robert Stan point out, it emerged at the height of Western imperialism and, like print media and the novel, played a major role in creating a masculinist imperial imaginary that continues to subliminally shape expectations of the projected moving image. We should be careful, however, not to embed American film and Hollywood as the primary location of film history, I just want to mention. It produces just a fraction of world cinema, and far from being an appendage to Western cinema, third cinema produces most of the world's films. I also want to mention that while the museum in its modern form is also a colonial institution, the first museum, the Alexandria Library in Egypt, was Egyptian, and that the root of the museum is a non-Western concept. The forced formation of Turtle Island, this country's indigenous name, into what's now known as the USA, was, as we know, part of a broader Western colonial expansion, and it also included Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Panama, the Philippines, Cuba, and Guam, whose indigenous people are geographically closer to Australia at the other side of the globe than to the US. So for the larger frame of Alan's show, and for our work here as allies, is this global indigeneity and global decolonization and the decentering of an American white cultural hegemony, including the moving image. In the creation of this global colonialism, this Plato to NATO Eurocentrism, and we should also remember that the West was constituted mainly by non-European influences, the intrusive colonial gaze was controlled through the camera by white colonizers, and it was used to capture and rearrange landscape and people, as well as for taxonomic, anthropological, racist purposes. The camera was positioned as a symbol of modernity and technological progressiveness, normalizing hierarchical power and a single white Western perspective. Time was reframed to be measured through a Eurocentric ontological reality to the rest of the world's shadow, with England, I'm ashamed to say, as the regulating center of linear temporal measurement, Greenwich Mean Time. Alan's exhibition definitively and assertively undoes this fiction and reverses the cinematic gaze as a projection of colonialist linear narratives of national self-consciousness. He also transforms not only the instrumental base of camera, projector, and screen, but also the role of the spectator, on which the cinematic institution usually depends for its imaginary realization. Instead of offering a spectator a mediated relationship with imaged others, reaffirming the imperial subject as superior and invulnerable, he foregrounds presence, vulnerability, shared space, and a wide horizontal projective space that refers to the native wampum belts, affirming, as Clemence White, my colleague who wrote a wonderful essay on Alan's work that you'll be able to read very shortly online, indigenous visual sovereignty, which, as Tuscarora artist and scholar Jolene Rickard argues, Clemence says, is inextricable from indigenous legal political sovereignty, a multifaceted concept encompassing the self-maintenance of communities, lands, and tradition. Clemence argues that Wolf Nation affirms the wampum belt and the socio-political system in which it's used. And as Jolene observes, traditions are a reinvestment in a shared ancient imaginary of self and a distancing strategy from the West. This can be clearly seen by comparing how we experience the land in Wolf Nation with the American Western movie, where, like 19th century painting, the land is depicted as both empty and virgin, a stage for expansionist fantasies. Wolf Nation, by contrast, haptically and subtly asserts the indigenous understanding of land as a sacred trust, historically consecrated and in need of nurturing. The West in white American cinema has always been depicted in terms of a journey westwards, transforming nature into culture, and the land is seen as a moving horizon. There is no horizon in Wolf Nation because there is no progress, in inverted commas, no wildness, in inverted commas, to be tamed, and no past and future. Alan resurfaces the painful memories precisely to resist the white attempt to frame the indigenous community in the past tense and thus dismiss their claims in the present. Our instinct in the dark room with a projection is usually to sit and wait for something to happen. A linear narrative, some dramatic moment with a resolution at the end. Alan's wolves don't give us that. We don't look at them, we inhabit the space with them. We tune into their quiet presence and realize that Alan is asking us to think about our relationship to the wolves and to their presence, to our own presence in the space of the room. The point is not to look at the screen, but to think about how what is on the screen relates to the space that we occupy. The wolves are occupying that space too, in a spectral way. In a simple but powerful way, Alan has reconfigured how we're experiencing space, recalibrating the gallery to indigenous concepts of time and space. Town Destroyer, also on the 5th floor, and Saponkanikan in the lobby that Alan made specifically for the exhibition with artist Stephen Fragale, use augmented reality. Augmented reality, as we know, uses technology to superimpose images, sound, and text on the world that we see. And Alan's proposing the idea of virtual space that this creates as being a kind of ethical space. The idea that an indigenous civilization was here before us is brought to us by cutting-edge technological means and brings up interesting questions, as Stephen pointed out. No one can own virtual space. So in these two works, a space has been created in which an indigenous space can coexist with this other space and can't be destroyed. The technology is here rewriting what technological progressiveness, in inverted commas, means and reframing it in indigenous terms. If no one owns virtual space, then an indigenous space can be created that points to a new model of what a shared space could look like. Alan's show affirms these principles of relationality and also survivance, a state of active presence and resistance, in a way that allows us to see how powerful these parallel worldviews of native culture are, and how we might start to imagine a different, more equitable relationship between us. From a curatorial point of view, in my opinion, this doesn't simply mean being additive, as though the inclusion of Indigenous artists into what is already there is enough. And I'm going to end by quoting Wanda, who's pointed out, quote, "Museums are cultural keepers who people come to learn stories and find out what our humanity is. How are we telling those stories, and who is telling them? This is at the core of what we are all working on and need to continue to work on together."
I think we can clap.
Like some Haudenosaunee people, circumstances separated me from our languages, but I do know how to say thank you. We say Nyawen. So Nyawen, Chrissie, for that lovely introduction and for your marvelous curation of the show. And Nyawen to Clemence for all her assistance in her impressive debut essay, and to our entire Whitney team, who've been a joy to work with. And a special one to curator Carrie Springer, who for the past 3 years has been a staunch ally of contemporary Indigenous art and brought Chrissie to see my work. And big nyawans to my amazing collaborators, artist and digital wizard Stephen Fragale, who designed the app for the new augmented reality works Town Destroyer and Saponkanikan. And virtuoso White Mountain Apache composer and musician Laura Ortman, who composed the beautiful soundtracks for Wolf Nation and Shadowmuck. And longtime collaborator, ace photographer, videographer, editor, and filmmaker Andre Constantini, who co-edited Wolf Nation and shot Shadowmuck with me. Also want to thank Nora Lawrence and Sarah Diver at Storm King, who commissioned Wolf Nation for their fantastic Indicators Artists on Climate Change exhibition last year. And also now went to Megan Hoyer, also a staunch ally, for planning and hosting this event and other Indigenous events. The part of Manhattan where we're standing now was once a beach and a Lenape fishing and planting site called Saponkanikan, which translates as tobacco field. The Lenape planted the native tobacco that, like corn, was cultivated by indigenous people for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. It was and still is ritually rather than casually smoked in pipes or burned in offerings. Rising smoke in that context is an indigenous axis mundi, a column of the sacred connecting earth and sky, and the place of offering, a center. There was such a center here before the Dutch, and like so many centers of native life, here and across the continent we call Turtle Island, nothing remains of it but a name, Saponkanikan. Nothing physical, that is, But that name connects us to more than just real estate. It connects us to another world with a set of practices, a set of cyclical doings like planting, hunting, and harvesting, not for material gain, but for much more. Courtesy of the imaging technology known as AR, or augmented reality, the astonishing technical wizardry of the astonishing technical wizardry of Stephen Fergali. When you download the app on your device, a ring of native tobacco appears in the lobby based on plants in my sister's garden at Six Nations Reserve. It's a site-specific interactive work that reads your position to center you within the tobacco circle and allows you to move among the virtual plants as you would in a real garden. There's another name I want to mention, a name that sparked another artwork in the show, Hanadagayas, which means town destroyer in our language, and was our name for George Washington. 240 years ago, in 1779, he issued the following orders to his generals. The expedition you are appointed to command is to be directed against the hostile tribes of the Six Nations of Indians, with their associates and adherents. The immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements, and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent their planting more. I would recommend that some post in the center of the Indian country should be occupied with all expedition, and with a sufficient quantity of provisions, one's party should be detached to lay waste all the settlements around, with instructions to do it in the most effectual manner, that the country may not be merely overrun but destroyed. But you will not by any means listen to any overture of peace before the total ruinment of their settlements is effected. Our future security will be their inability to injure us, and in the terror with which the severity of the chastisement they receive will inspire them. The Haudenosaunee people of the Longhouse, also known as the Six Nations or the Iroquois Confederacy, consisting of the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Tuscarora, Oneida, and Mohawk nations, were the first native nations that the fledgling United States went to war with. The first who were attacked by an American army that outnumbered them 5-1, who burned their houses to the ground, destroyed their crops and orchards, their entire food supply, plundered their livestock and goods, and ransacked their graves. They were the first, but no means the last, to flee for their lives, homeless in their own homelands, ahead of a United States Army who wanted their land and took it. This campaign was known as the Sullivan Expedition, after one of Washington's generals, John Sullivan, after whom Sullivan Street, here in the village in Soho, is named. Perhaps it's time for a name change. Statues are not the only form of monuments. The Whitney occupies the block bordered on the east by Washington Street and on the south by Gansevoort Street, named for Peter Gansevoort, a colonel in the Sullivan campaign. Yesterday at lunch with Chrissie and Richard, we reimagined them as Hanadagaya Street and Sapaunkanakan Street. Town Destroyer, the second AR work in the show, accessible through the same brilliant app Stephen built, surfaces that dark history of invasion and eviction, which set the stage for the subsequent illegal and fraudulent land grabs by speculators and New York State in violation of federal treaties and law. Various attempts at redress in the courts, including with the Supreme Court, have unsurprisingly failed. I've fallen behind in my reading lately, but came across two recent items that stood out. The first was a headline from the cover of the current issue of the New York Review of Books, which reads, Michael Gora, Reckoning with Evil Histories, and points to his review of, quote, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil, by Susan Neiman, which, he writes, quote, wants to show how the country's schools and intellectuals, its ordinary people and its politicians too, have worked to, quote, acknowledge the evils their nation committed, and summarizes the crux of the author's argument as, quote, if the Germans of all people can do it, why can't we? The second is from Elizabeth Kolbert's Talk of the Town piece on the 16-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg in the current New Yorker, Thunberg, in which she includes the following quote from Greta's address to the French Parliament this past summer. Maybe you are simply not mature enough to tell it like it is, because even that burden you leave to us children. We become the bad guys who have to tell people these uncomfortable things because no one else wants to or dares to. Well, Indigenous artists are daring to, and have been daring to tell it like it is for quite some time. But what's different and maybe important about this moment is that institutions are now beginning to listen. 4 years ago, Richard invited me to participate at the iteration of Embassy he staged here in the city at Performa 15. Embassy is a brilliant work, a global big tent for big ideas and conversation, connecting disparate communities, and I had participated in the first international one in Moscow. At the time, I was despairing over the invisibility of indigenous contemporary art in a supposedly cosmopolitan arts center like New York. And as an experiment, I entered the words Native American on the websites of the major museums here and displayed what came up in the form of screenshots in my presentation. To say that the results were sorry is grossly overgenerous. Apart from NMAI, the only institution whose website turned up a contemporary artist under that rubric was the Whitney. On a media webpage featuring, quote, audio guide stops to works by Georgia O'Keeffe, Adolph Gottlieb, and Will Barnett was the thumbnail of a familiar work, Jimmy Durham's Choose Any 3. It was the only thumbnail of artwork on the page without a caption listing, title and date, and the only one that was a kid's audio guide stop. Attempts for more information on the site brought up at that time no results, which is what I adopted as the title of my talk. And Jimmy was the only representative from Indian country in the inaugural exhibition, America is Hard to See, at the newly opened Whitney that year. Embassy took place in November, and in December, my longtime friend and colleague, Karen Coney, director of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics at the New School, with whom I had recently met, and to whom I raved about indigenous contemporary art and its global dimensions, informed me about a new grant from the Rubin Foundation for Art and Politics and asked if I wanted to co-apply for funding for a program series we could co-curate, we conceptualized as, quote, Indigenous New York. It would be an unusual partnership between artist and institution, but Richard had demonstrated in Embassy that artists can convene to great effect. We got the funding and co-curated, with the help of my friend, Klingon artist Jackson Paulus, a series of events to initiate a dialogue between indigenous curators, writers, and artists with their counterparts in art institutions here in New York. Indigenous New York convened vital participants like Richard and Wanda in roundtable discussions, followed by public panels that both broadened and energized the cultural landscape here. A number of participants were from the Whitney, Carrie Springer, Jenny Goldstein, Elizabeth Sussman, Laura Phipps, and Megan Hoyer, and their engagement resulted in the creation of an Indigenous Artists Working Group here, and a growing commitment by the Whitney to contemporary Indigenous art, demonstrated in recent acquisitions and exhibitions like this year's Biennial in Wolf Nation, as well as events like this one. America is easier to see with James Luna in the house, with Laura Ortman and Nicholas Gallinen in the house, with Sky Hopinka, Jackson Paulus, and the Khalils in the house, with Jeffrey Gibson, Carolyn Monet, Tirza Cuthand in the house, and with Wolf Nation in the house. Native America, unfortunately, is still very hard to see at MoMA. In fact, it's impossible. A growing number of visitors who've seen the new MoMA came away after an exhausting scavenger hunt for Native art from Canada or the US, none of which was to be found, disappointed and offended. Somebody please wake up that institution. It's 2019. Richard invited me to participate in his Venice extravaganza this past spring, which included an iteration of Embassy installed in a park around the corner from a gallery where I was showing a new work sponsored by a Venetian arts organization, Zueka Projects. Curator Max Kuroki invited Nadia Mir and I to respond to Venice's role in colonization of Turtle Island and explore the links between Venice and our homelands. Venetians were explorers, navigators, cartographers, authors, and makers of trade beads. I'm going to play you documentation of the 4-channel video installation I made for the show, but first a little setup. I called it Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, Theater of the World, after the first modern European world atlas, whose 450th anniversary is this coming year. The work consists of 4 videos synchronized and projected sequentially onto 4 large white marine buoys installed on the floor at the 4 cardinal points. Its design references and models a second iconic atlas, the 1708 Harmonia Microcosmica of Andreas Salarius, specifically the Scenographia Systematis Copernicani, illustrating Copernicus' heliocentric model of the universe, which pictures 4 globes arrayed around a central sun, and also references the large globes in Sala dell'Escudo, the map room of the Palazzo Ducale. The videos project one at a time in a sequence, starting with the one titled Les Sauvages, after the name of Rameau's harpsichord suite in G major, composed after he witnessed 2 captive natives from French Louisiana perform a war dance for Louis XV in 1725, a musical example of the colonial imaginary. Rameau later recycled and expanded the popular piece in his opera ballet Les Ondes Galantes, which is the musical part of the soundtrack of the second projection entitled Viaggi, Voyages. Viaggi and the remaining two videos appropriate archival material to present colonization from the Haudenosaunee perspective up to the present day. The third video is called War Dance, and the musical part of the soundtrack is A Tribe Called Red's Northern Cree Redskin Girl. The fourth is called Relations, and the music is Ise Yesos Sawenio, a Christian song performed by Akwesasne Mohawk Kathleen Thompson. The speakers are Mohawk artist and activist Ellen Gabriel and Akwesasne Mohawk activist Richard Oakes, who led the Native American occupation of Alcatraz Island 50 years ago in 1969. So can we have the first video, please?
Colonizers were coming from places that they themselves were sick. They themselves had twisted minds. People like Jacques Cartier and Columbus, these were not the people who were like the greatest minds of their societies. These were pirates. They raped and they pillaged. This is who their monarchs sent out. And now they are the historical figures that every single child learns about. They couldn't understand us. They didn't want to understand us.
We will further guide the inhabitants in the proper way of living. We will offer them our religion, our education, our life ways, in order to help them achieve our level of civilization and thus raise them and all their white brothers up from their savage and unhappy state.
That this is a 300-year-old problem, and the government refuses to fix it. The Longhouse people have been saying, we want to be part of the solution, but we are excluded. non sagalo yage no koni no dagya ogon. De wandera ne kasera no katiro sone Jesus ne jada kato watonda holy wado gadi goa. Kandoro na yongesate Hokstachio liwatani Ayar hege yondatlona Kalogi he dosanige. Se vayada dogati so swana kere kalo yage ye chia de la nayani hek yonda tlona no one jage.
This way. Hey, yeah, there you go. Thanks for that, bro. That was fantastic. I think the way that you presented them in Venice, you know, on the globes, rounded out your presentation, and I think softens the messages in some way. Talking about the global contemporary art world, you know, the global indigenous. Well, we've been doing a bit of that ourselves. You know, like I got to say that I see myself not as an artist. I see myself as an activist masquerading as an artist. Fuck, it's fun too. You know, like it's really good. You know, so, like, I got into art, and it was an accident. My younger brother wanted to do something with in tourist art. So I started out in tourist art. I was, you know, painting boomerangs and spears and shit like that. You know, so. And this white guy came along one day, and he said, I was sitting there painting little pretty pictures or something. You know, he said, why don't you get into fine art? I said, what are you talking about? Look at these fine lines here. You know, so I had no idea, you know, what contemporary art was. You know, like. What this phenomenon, you know, that I now know as Western art. I wondered what it was, and this guy, you know, just said, you know, insisted that I get into this contemporary art, you know, and I just wasn't taking any notice. And then he said, you know, you can say and do things in art, you know. you know, and not get arrested. You know, like I thought, fuck, I'm into this. You know, so I did. Was there a warning here that this is, you know, explicit language and you know, this is for adults? You know?
The internet doesn't care.
Oh, yeah, I don't care either. But it's so getting into art. You look, I didn't want to go to art school, you know, to learn about things. So I figured that if I spoke to all, you know, a whole heap of people, you look, who knew about art, you know, like I could, you know, interrogate them, you know, like get them drunk, get them stoned, whatever, you know, like, and you know, pump with food and shit, you know. So they'd tell me things, you know, like, and they did, you know, like, so that's how I learned about art, you know, going through this process and doing it, you know, like there was a lot of questions, you know, that came up out of it, you know, and what I discovered, you know, was that no, this was, you know, that contemporary art, you know, wasn't like colonising other places. And that it was, it had just absorbs everything else. You know, like, absorbed, you know, every culture. You know, like, and just sorted it out. You know, like, and you know, of course, you know, Western art was, you know, in the centre, and you know, reached into the skies. You know, like, and our stuff was, you know, over there, and below and to the side of Western art. You know, particularly the art of, you know, the Western white male. You know, so it was the province of these sort of things. So within this sort of thing, we've got this global Indigenous, and you know. The West, you know, is very slow getting to this idea that, you know, there's other parts of the world, you know, like in that these other places, you know, like had, you know, civilizations and cultures, you know, long before the emergence of Western art. So, and it's my job. I see. I saw that there was this thing, you know, called Western art, you know, like, and I didn't want to be part of that stuff, you know, because, you know, my position was below and to the side. So I said, fuck that, you know. So I created my own world, you know, my own art world, you know, and I positioned me in my art world right beside Western art, just, you know, no better than, but not less than either. So, and that's and I've been able to look at myself, position myself in the discussions, the discourses and that, you know, as the equal to all everybody. You know, like, so I refused to accept, you know, the position that they would give me. You know, so well, I think they caught on too. You know, like a show at the Tate Modern, you know, like in the Turbine Hall. You know, it's kind of, you know, an acknowledgement that, yeah, gee, this art world's just as good. You know, so, and in talking with my people, you know, like who, you know, very often, you know, aren't very well educated, know next to nothing, you know, about the art and culture of the West. You know, very civilized, very cultured people. They just could not understand and couldn't be bothered, you know, like because it bore no resemblance to them. You know, they could go into a museum, you know, like, and they couldn't recognise, you know, themselves or their people, you know, like the friends and relatives, you know, in what was in these museums and that sort of thing. So, and asking me what I was doing, you know, they would, you know, ask, well, what is this stuff about, you know. And I explained it in terms of sport, you know, because, you know, elitism is not allowed, you know, like in the art world, you know, like, but, you know, in the sporting world, yeah, you know, we can put them fuckers up there like they're gods, you know. So, but then, you know, in the arts, you know, it's very different, you know. And I explained how we fitted into the, you know, the system. You know, like I described, you know, the museums and the art galleries as stadiums. You know, like we would go and play. So, and you know, like if you want to be a player, you want to be a good player. You know, so. You know, and you want to play in the best stadiums, you know, the biggest stadiums, you know, for the most money too, you know, so which is kind of handy, you know. You can buy nice hats and pretty shoes and shit, you know. So in that really simplified context, you know, like I make my work. My work is for my people. You know, like that's. I want them to be empowered. I want them to, you know, to understand, you know, that we'd been brutally colonised. You know, like and we've had everything, virtually everything, taken from us. And for them, you know, like my approach is Aboriginal. Like you were talking about the Indigenous, you know, thinking, you know, with respect to your work and that sort of thing. You know, they could recognise this Indigenous thinking, you know, in the work. So, and it's just as legitimate as thing, you know, and as Western art. So, and there's this. Supposed need for us, you know, to fit into Western art, you know. Whereas I just think that's a whole heap of crap, you know, like because why should art that is thousands of years old fit into something that's just a few hundred years old, you know? So, and if, you know, aliens dropped onto the planet, you know, in the next couple of weeks, you know, like, and decided to build a museum in Brisbane, Australia, you know, like, I'm sure that, you know, I'm absolutely certain that the content of that museum would not be 90%, you know, white male, you know, like, and, you know, or 95% white male, you know, 4% white female, and 1% for the rest of the world, which just happens to be 90%, you know, of the world's population. You know, so yeah, we have these sort of things need to be looked at. You know, I commend the Whitney for, you know, moving on from, you know, the no result, you know, like of just 4 years ago, you know, to having a show, you know, like with Alan Michelson here, and then there's all those native artists in the other show, you know, like the best work too, you know. So I see us making inroads, you know, from when I started, you know, in the late 80s. You know, I was still making tourist art into the 90s. You know, like because the kind of stuff that I made, you know, like didn't sell very well, because you know, it was quite confronting. You know, like I'm not a racist. I just don't like you white KUNTs. You know, so you know, I did stuff like that. You know, like and I was you know, I thought it was quite funny at the time. You know, so. But so I think I've gotten, you know, a bit more subtle these days. You know, but well, I'm trying. You know,
It doesn't come naturally.
yeah. Well, you know, like I am trying. You know, I don't hate white people. You know. I just don't like them. You know. No, look, it's. I'm so happy to be invited here. You know, like to sit up on the stage. You know, like I'm really well. This is the best job I've ever had in my life. You know, like fuck me. You know, traveling all around the world. You know, like getting to meet all these really. Cool people, but nice and, you know, smart as all fuck. You know, I learn so much. I'm still learning. You know, like, now you'll. Oh shit.
So what's this thing here?
Oh, okay. Right. Okay. Well, let's get to this year. Okay. You know, when we both turned 66. You know, so we're old fuckers. You know, in contemporary art, you know, like, which is a young person's game, you know, like 90% of the audience is, you know, is like under 30 or some shit, you know, so, you know,
That's why they bring me with them.
yeah, oh, well, we're very welcoming, you know, like, so, we're... Oh, Wanda, you're still very young, you know, so it's fine. Yeah, but like here we have, you know, we have to, you know, compete, you know, like with the younger people, you know. So I don't compete with them. I can just do whatever the fuck I want, you know, like, you know, and I try to have as much fun as I can, you know, like, in trying to get. Ideas, you know, like about, you know, what's going on around us, you know, like, and you know, like Western art was a great idea at the time. You know, but.
Can you tell us something about the Aboriginal Embassy?
Okay, the Aboriginal Embassy project that I do is it's in 1972. Aboriginal people were brought to a crossroads, and they decided that they had to do this national protest, you know, like against the government, which was not cooperating in any way, you know, with our calls for land rights and for land for us. In the state that I lived, you know, like, we weren't allowed to actually own land under the white law until 1986. So, you know, when you consider that real estate, you know, is the number one wealth creation scheme in Australia, you know, like, we weren't allowed to participate in that until 1986. Anyway, in 1972, these Aboriginal people from Sydney decided that we should set up an Aboriginal tent embassy on the lawns across from Parliament House, you know, which is, you know, in our national capital, sort of the equivalent of Washington, and they went down there, went to Canberra, you know, to set up this tent embassy, and well, they sent 4 guys down there, but they didn't have much of a budget, you know, so, well, they didn't have any budget, so they got down there and they realised they didn't have a tent. So they went around all the blackfellas, you know, they could see, and tried to get themselves a tent. None of them had it, so they went around all the white people working in the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. And you know, asked them if they had a tent. None of them had a tent, so they had a beach umbrella. The first Aboriginal tent embassy was a beach umbrella. And in about 2011, 2012, the young people around Australia started setting up tent embassies, you know, like in the cities and towns, you know, like around the country. Oh, damn! This is amazing, you know, like because this thing was happening, and the young people. They actually got sovereignty on the table. We could never get sovereignty, you know, on the table. You know, like the tent embassy was an assertion of sovereignty, and so I decided that I would make a tribute, you know, to both the original embassy, but also to an acknowledgement of the work of the young people, you know, who were starting these new protests, you know, like, and actually got sovereignty on the table, you know, for us to talk about. So the first time I did it, you know, like I did it in Melbourne, which, by the way, is the global capital of content-free art. And we had our town destroyers in Australia too. And yeah, so. Well, of course, the first embassy that I did was a beach umbrella. And I got one of the main organisers of that first embassy to come and he opened the exhibition, which I called Lessons in Etiquette and Manners, for the colonisers. Like that, they kind of had bad manners, thinking that they'd come in, and take a whole continent, and not expect to pay anything for it, raping and pillaging, along the way. So I thought I'd give them some lessons, in how to get things right. And anyway, there's this big thing, like in Venice every 2 years. You heard it? You might have heard of it. The Venice Biennale. And it's a thing where nations, send representatives, to represent the nation, with the best examples of contemporary art, supposedly. Anyway, a couple of years ago, they changed the way that they were going to. They chose the artists for Venice, and they opened it up for artists to put forward proposals. So I put a proposal very late, I might add. I think it was about 4 hours before the deadline closed, and I sat down with a friend of mine, and she did most of the work, and I guided her, of course. So. And we put in this proposal, which I called, I don't really need this. Well, like my proposal was to... Pardon? Oh, okay. Fuck, I thought I had 15 minutes.
You do.
It passed.
Oh. Okay, well, that's it.
No, take some time to do the
Yeah, at least finish the...
Oh, okay, well,
I was there, so...
yeah. Well, there might be a picture of you here in a minute. Yeah, well, I'd...
Sylvia McAdam.
Yeah, that's Jemana Mana, Megan Cope. Ooh, Alan Michelson. These are Sami. That's Michael Tausig, philosopher. They're my friends. They led my team in Venice. So I put in a proposal. My proposal was to wrap the Australian Pavilion in chains. Lock every fucker out for the entire 6 months. No, I could have saved them, like a whole heap of money. They wouldn't have to pay any invigilators and that sort of thing. And the people going to the Venice Biennale wouldn't have to wait around, to get into the fucking pavilion. They could just go by, take a photo, put it on Instagram, make me famous. Jesus. I was trying to help everybody, and they knocked me back. So anyway, I've got some more pictures here.
Made a model, put it on a board.
Yeah. So anyway, when they didn't give me the gig, I decided, fuck it, I'm going anyway. And so I built a model of the Australian Pavilion. Wrapped that in chains, put it on a barge, and sailed it up and down past the Biennale. I thought it was funny too. Well, there you go. Look at that. God damn it, Venice. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wait there. There you go back, this way. Yeah. And the embassy was in that park there. And there is one of the Russian yachts, and there was another one over here. Sort of thing. So, we had this Aboriginal tent embassy, parked in between these two yachts, two super yachts. All these Russian billionaires and that sort of thing. So, okay, fuck it, that's it. How do you?
Leave that image up because it's a good one.
We're not going to leave it up. Wanda said leave it up, yeah.
Do what I say. I'm just kidding. Anin, Bojo, hello. Wanda Nanibush, Nadijnakas, Mayengando Dem, Chimnasing, Donjiba. I am Wolf Clan. I come from Chimnasing. It's a big island in Georgian Bay. I'm the youngest of 18. I have beautiful brothers and sisters. None of them are in the arts. They say because I'm the youngest, so I got to go and do crazy things, and they had to work harder. And I have over 100 nieces and nephews and great nieces and nephews, so we are definitely taking back the country one baby at a time. And I think the population globally is over 340 million. So I want to talk a bit about this, how Christie sort of began us, and insert some ideas, some guideposts, some little thoughts, and then I want to make sure we have time for a conversation and maybe some time for questions. So I will be briefer. So thinking about global, we were always already global as Indigenous people. So we didn't become global through colonization. We didn't become global through anything else. We were global before because this was our land. And this border that exists between Canada and the US didn't exist, and didn't exist between Mexico and the US, and didn't exist between South America and North America. And I think this is really important to think about, especially in this kind of crisis of migration, of refugees that we're having in the world today. So we don't acknowledge the border. So you really got to change the name of this museum. And we were global in a number of senses, in the sense that all of our nations we knew each other to an extent. We moved in and out of each other's territories, often using different parts of a territory at different parts of the year. So this idea that the land kind of belongs to one nation and one area, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. Cities are really complicated places in this sense of history. We were global in the sense that we traded things from the top to the bottom. Michael Belmore is an amazing artist who talks a lot about copper and how copper, you can see the kind of relationships between Indigenous people through the movement of copper from the north to the south, and how the kind of artistry of that use of that copper changes. We also, I think, because we've been here forever, we didn't come over a land bridge. We would have had to move in and out as the ice ages came and went. And so our people are related all the way across both continents. So moving into colonization and a different kind of sense of the global, I think is really important to keep always in mind, because we can't have this freewheeling global art travel world without also understanding that colonization still exists in terms of all the same routes of extraction are still taking place out of North America, out of Africa, out of South America. I think it's really extremely important if we're going to think about a global Indigenous in the sense of the art world, that we cannot separate. So thinking about Jolene's comment, that quote that was used, talking about visual sovereignty, we cannot separate this kind of mode of extraction and destruction from, how our roots of art travel. So I wanted to think about this in terms of where who are the artists that are being shown? Who are the artists that are being picked up by the Venice Biennale? Who are the artists who are not being picked up by the Venice Biennale, but, insert themselves anyway? And who are people writing about, interested in? And I wanted to also couple that with this idea of sovereignty. So how can we create the movement of our art outside of its own lands, and the movement of our artists in a way that is Indigenous-led? So rather than knocking at the doors of the institutions, how can we turn towards each other and create a kind of strength and knowledge that we have of each other's work, because we know who each other are globally, and figure out who would we put forward. You know, who are the artists that we respect and love and understand and support. That project became Abaquad. And part of that, it's a word in our language, Anishinaabe language, that means it clears after a storm. So I love our language because it's all like descriptive and metaphorical and poetic. And my language teachers would slam me for just using that word all by itself, but I do it anyway. But this idea that we can take a moment. The storm is it's just stopping, and then it's going to clear, and the sun starts to peek out, and you start to dry up a little bit, and things become more colorful. And I think we can sit in that moment, but that is just a moment. It's not to say that colonization is finished. It's just we can breathe in it because we have enough power today to do that. We can take a pause and figure out how we want to go forward together. So I wanted to bring together artists, curators, and thinkers to have a conversation with each other. So to create an Indigenous-led space inside the institution, an intimate space where we can have conversations about what's important to us. It isn't directed outward, actually, at an audience. The audience is there merely to listen. Which is an interesting thing, because that's what the world needs to do right now, and that's what we're all relearning how to do, even to listen to the earth, as your work does so beautifully. So part of that was inspired by Alan Michelson's project here, Indigenous New York, because I was thinking, okay, so who needs to listen? Right? And he had already done this work with institutions here. So I thought, let's invite the institutions to come and learn about the artists that we're putting forward. And I think when we work, we tend to go towards the same. And so the danger is that you will always pick contemporary artists that look like every other contemporary artist in every other culture that you currently, buy or purchase. And it's really difficult to get out of that mindset and get out of that aesthetic. And it's also choosing artists that don't go towards urban centers is a really difficult thing for institutions. And it's something that I think is really important in the Indigenous context, is that you have to step outside of that. And there's also artists who work from a completely different worldview that are also getting sidelined in this kind of global grab for Indigenous art. And they are people we love and respect, and so that was part of it. And also to start building our own histories and our own sense of lineage between ourselves. I didn't bring my timer up, so is somebody making sure that I'm not over-talking? Okay. 5 minutes. Okay. So we are also going to go to the Sydney Biennale, and we've decided to do it in Toronto and then do it internationally year by year, because our people, you can have more artists from a specific place, and it's really important also, if you're working with artists and artwork, to go to their home, to their land. It's like, I know it's stupid, but when I'm really interested in Middle Eastern art, and it wasn't until I started traveling to where people make the art that I suddenly understood so much more about where the art is coming from. And I think it's a sense of responsibility towards that, so that we want to also support Brooke Andrews, who's curating it, and he's an Indigenous artist. And also, we had so many Australians traveling this way, we should travel to you because it's such a long flight. And I think the last thing I want to say about the global is that when we think about modernity and the spread of this kind of idea of the civilizing mission and modernity, deeply tied to colonization and extraction, we are at the center of that story. We're not marginal to that story. Even when you think about the history of film as you told it when you were standing up here, the first people to be filmed by Edison in 1893 were Indigenous people. He did this short that came out in 1894 called The Sioux Ghost Dance, or The Ghost Dance, which is, racist. Everyone's doing like these really stereotypical kind of movements. It's not a ghost dance. And those guys, so I was curious about those guys. I wanted to know who they were. So they were part of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And Buffalo Bill liked to have authenticity in his spectacles of colonization. So he would often find like actual people who were involved in the Indian Wars in the US to be part of these spectacles. And so these guys he found in a prison. They were prisoners, and they had been arrested as they were coming out of and leaving the Wounded Knee Massacre. So I thought about them, and I think at the time, our ceremonies were banned in Canada and the US, in North America. But what became popular were kind of staging of these kinds of stereotypical ceremonies and things. So I stopped looking at that as some kind of stereotypical film and saw it then as a stand-in for our resistance. So instead of staying in jail, these guys I'll go travel the world, and they did. They traveled the entire world, made some money, went back home, and enriched their communities with whatever they had learned. And so I think the global, has always belonged to us in that sense as well. And we're like the center of the story, not the margin. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Wanda, and thank you, Alan and Richard. So now we're going to have a conversation. Well, the three of you, I want to just not insert myself very much into it, because this is about you. But one thing maybe I can mention to start you off is that all three of you talked about your work in a way that underlines the Indigenous as a kind of process ontology. Alan, you once said to me, this is a verb, not a noun way of doing things. And so I wonder if you could maybe all of you talk a little bit about that, because it seems that that's also a very powerful way of also asserting voices, asserting independent voices, and making those voices central and not marginal.
Well, maybe Wanda, maybe you would better, because you can speak the language, and the language embodies some of these concepts of action over noun, over object, right?
I'm not fluent anymore, so.
Okay, well, the idea of relationality, that everything is alive and interrelated, is what I was meaning, as opposed to a world of dead or semi-dead objects or about to be controlled or dominated objects, which seems to be where science seems to have taken us in some respects, or capitalism, or certain sorts of philosophies seem to end up in this really dead place, this really scary dead place, and the whole earth is now endangered by those sorts of philosophies. So the idea of indigenous cosmologies as something that's not involved with that, that's it's holding things together in a way. And
yeah, I think that's very true. And if you look at our languages, it's divided into animate and inanimate, and living and dead things. And majority of things are living, including like rocks and things like this. But this idea of that all things are related. We carry into this political space, like I think Richard's project is also doing this. Whenever, like we know about the tent embassy in our nations because we are always looking to each other to see what strategies people are using. When I was in Norway, we were in Sami territory and Sápmi, and this woman who you had up there on the picture, Lisa, she was telling me that her family member had taken a Sami contingent in 1972 to the west coast of BC to attend what would become the World Congress of Indigenous People eventually, which would lead to the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Rights. And when they got there, everybody's like, who are these white people? Because they're blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and it's quite weird at first. And then they sang the yoik, which is their like traditional song. And everybody was like, oh, yep, you're Indigenous. Like immediately, they knew. But that led to the sovereignty movement in Sápmi. So, we're related in that way.
Yeah. I went to Banff first in 2004, and I went back in 2008, and I was talking with Alex Jeanvier.
Yeah, I was there too.
Yeah. Oh, I know. And anyway, he was telling me that he could speak for days, with these people, and not mention a noun. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so and there's this obsession, in today's cultures, to name everything, that you do. When you have something really cold, they got a name, a name for that. Your brain freeze, something like that. It's called a brain freeze or some shit. So they'll name everything, which is goddamn ridiculous. So
I thought that was interesting in your work, like talking about naming, and how that is a process of colonization, but also can be the reverse. Do you want to speak to that a little?
Well, there's that moment in the second of the 4 videos that I showed where you see the map without any names, and then all the names. Of course, they were there, and I had to take them away to show them popping up in a way. But just the sheer arrogance of coming over to a strange place and thinking you can just rename it all, after your saints or after your, and then not act very saintly, when you're there. I mean, I think most of the time people were greeted with hospitality that was answered with all sorts of hostility and paranoia and, the rest, and greed. Yeah, so I've been, I've been titling my works for a long time after place names, and they're so beautiful, and they are poetic in themselves, and even Hannah de Gaius. So I commissioned for this work, Town Destroyer, which is the translation, the English sort of quick translation. But when I talked to some language experts at Six Nations, somebody said it really means he bites the town, And our name, Haudenosaunee means they build the house. We're not the longhouse people. That's the noun version. We're they build the house. So
that's like our word for ourselves in Anishinaabe was translated as the original ones. I think they did that with so many of our words, which would never mean the same thing. But the translation I really like is spontaneous ones. And then for the creator, Gitchimanadu, it's like they used to translate it as the creator, like almost like God, right? Very masculine, very substantive. That's like a Western way of thinking about it. The actual translation is the great mystery. So being the spontaneous one, who believes in the great mystery is a completely different world than the original one who believes in the creator.
I was interested in what you said about the Whitney needs to rename itself. And I wanted to ask the three of you, what would you rename the Whitney as? Go ahead, Richard.
This is your moment, baby.
Oh, God. I'm sure, Alan has already thought about this.
Well, when it was uptown, and I think there was metal letters on the outside, I did sometimes subtract letters. And if you subtract the N,
Whitey?
you get. And if you subtract the T, so I don't know if either of those would work, but maybe the Richard Bell Museum. How's that, Rich?
No, I want to build my own.
But I think if you're
Any rich collectors here? I got work available. I want to earn enough to build a museum.
I mean, that's an interesting idea. Would we build museums? Yes, we would, I think, still. Anyway, I think what I'm referring to is much more about that border, those borders, right? So what the museum is called doesn't really bother me. It's more about the concept around America and whether we can't, you say you're in your mandate is to also challenge that idea of what America is. But to truly challenge it, you would have to start from an Indigenous-centered space.
Yeah. I'm just checking the time.
Yeah, we could help you, in indigenizing the place, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but a bit like Khalees says,
We're here for you.
We could teach you, but we'd have to charge.
we started with the lobby, I think.
Yes, exactly.
We did? Yeah, you did. You
We're
did.
going to work our way up.
You are on the 5th floor, so that's good.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we have time for some questions as well as any other points or thoughts that you have in relation to each other and talking to each other. So I just want to see if the audience has any questions or thoughts. For the speakers. Yes.
Oh, look at all you beautiful people.
You want me to come over there?
No.
Thank you.
Yeah, am I alive? Yeah. This was great. This was great. I really, really enjoyed you all, and I loved the work. What I was struck by two things. One was a quality of rhythm to all of your work that seemed really different to me than most Western white work. That doesn't seem to have rhythm at all, for the most part. And the other was a sense of equanimity that you project about the horrors of your past history. As a white person looking at your past history, I'm as horrified by that as I am by the Holocaust, or any Holocaust or ecocide for that matter. And yet, it's striking how much kindness and humor and patience you bring to these issues. And I just came from Vera List, where a number of other Indigenous people were presenting, and I noted that about them as well. I'd love to hear a bit more about how you deal with horror.
We call it genocide. I can answer the second one first and then get us started, and then you guys can jump in at any second. Just because I think, if you can't laugh, you die. It's like kind of that kind of thing, but also it's cultural for me, and for all of us. That's something we seem to share, is like the value of humility and like where we come from means that you can't take yourself so seriously. So even in trauma, even in pain, you will be, you're supposed to kind of like get outside of your sense of your own importance in a way. That's what humor does. So it's a way to keep people humble, including ourselves. I would start there.
You want me to talk about being humble?
You really are.
Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble.
We love doing karaoke together, the three of us, so we may just bust out in songs.
We're all hoarse from it.
Yeah, you can hear
We'll carry
it.
that
We've been singing
We're
our,
just screaming away in a room.
after the openings.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, God damn it! Look, humor is so important to our lives. It's such a big part. I don't know whether it's a defense mechanism, that is developed, in response to the trauma that and including the intergenerational trauma that we all face. God damn it, I could not, do anything without humour. I do this job, because I'm unteachable and unemployable. So I've got to be funny as well. So okay.
There was a question over here. Yes.
I have a simple question for all of you. You probably will answer it in your own way. What does an Indigenous hegemony look like for you?
An Indigenous what?
An Indigenous hegemony, where
Translate that word.
So, like where the prevailing culture of the world is native and central to that ideology, rather than a Western.
It would be a lot friendlier and a lot more, humour for starters.
There'd be karaoke. Required.
Yeah. Well,
There'd be more than
like
17
everything
wolves.
is related.
There'd be more than 17 wolves.
Yeah. What happened to the other mob? The bear and thing? We just got wolves on this thing.
One at a time.
Wolves first. Yeah. Look, I've never imagined, what that would look like. I dare to imagine victory. What would it look like, if we came to terms with the colonizer? I'm still, I don't even know what that would look like. I've posed the question, to our people, what do we want? Most people don't know. They're so busy surviving that they can't even spend the time to think about what's really important in their lives. That is the tragedy that's facing us, is that our people are so impoverished that they can't think, about these things.
I gave a lecture, and there's some of it's online, but about Indigenous-led Canada, because it's like, what would that look like? I think about that, but I think I would come at this as an Anishinaabe person. So the center of our universe is actually the child. So in terms of what I think about what would the world look like if it were, from an Anishinaabe point of view, the centering of the child is the centering of the mother, is the centering of women, is the centering of the earth. So it kind of is related in this sense. There's still men there,
We help. Make the children.
Yes, we help make the children sometimes. No, but it's also not a heterosexual universe in the way that it's sounding right now. But if you take the center as the child, children are considered to be closest to the spirit world because they're just coming from there. And then the elders are also the closest to the spirit world because they're heading there. So then immediately you have this relationship between the old and the young that's kind of built into the system. So I think we live in a world that is so, children are not the center of our universe at all. They're the center of a home, but not of the world. And if you center children, you center humanity in a big way. You think about all these kids dying, like in ships, and like trying to get food, or you think about kids who are, used as labor. It's like, what kind of fucking world is this? And I think that is for me like the center of where I think from, is like how what do we do, to make sure that life is good for children.
Yeah, we have the Haudenosaunee are supposed to make decisions so that the 7 generations forward would, considering 7 generations into the future. And we're not like making decisions 7 minutes into the future right now.
Does anybody else have any questions or thoughts? Yes.
I'm curious what you would include in your museum.
Richard.
Well, if it's Richard's museum, it's just going to be Richard.
That's a lie, that's a lie, that's a goddamn lie. That'd be me and my friends, my friends and relatives. Fuck it, that's what.
I'm in.
Yeah, you're in. Honestly, that's who we're thinking. The people who are relevant, to me, my world, my worldview, and this sort of thing. So, we have to share. That. That's what we have to do. So, if I make a shitload of money, if some of these collectors here, help me along, I can get this museum up, built, I can start buying shit from my friends and that, it'll be really good then, They won't have to worry about being poor and that sort of thing. They can think about these really important issues in their lives.
You won't have to be chaining up museums, you'll have your own.
Yeah, well, chain that fucker up too.
It's interesting, this whole thing of museums, 'cause I was just in Sao Paulo recently, and you joke, but you are really intensely committed to thinking through poverty, as a central thing that we have to address, Richard. And we were in Sao Paulo, my friend Nana was there too, and it really struck me that this place is part of it, and my museum as well. Like, there's a way of traveling through such privilege, like globally, like we can wind up in a place and never actually see it, or never actually engage the people that live there, or never actually see how people try to survive in that place. And you really have to get the hell out of the museum to do that. And I think that's the central problem with museums. They could bring that into them, so that you don't have to leave the museum to go do that. I mean, not that I want to live permanently in a museum, but that would be colonial.
Wanda's World.
Yes.
Adam's Family.
Please don't put my bones in a museum like you did to my ancestors. But what I'm saying is that I think we can't anymore privilege art in this way. I think we need to think about art's relationship to the rest of the world and what's going on in it. Otherwise, we're irresponsible.
I think that's a great moment to end on. It's a very, very important statement that's just been made. And thank you. Thank you, Wanda. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Richard.
Thank
You've
you
given
very
us
much.
so much to think about and act on. It's a verb, not a noun, so thank you.
Thank you, Chrissie.
Thank you for your show.
Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Whitney.